name is Ceri. I've been working at the Lego Group for just over a year. I come from the UK, and before working at the Lego Group, I worked mainly in central government for the UK, researching people and security to try and understand how do we influence people a bit better, how do we understand people more, and how do we actually build security that works for people instead of just believing they'll do what we want because we say so. So a bit about me. So as I said, I come from a background working in central government mainly, doing a lot of research, which requires quite a lot of logic, working with academics, but one of the main parts of my job was actually how do you translate research into practice? How do you make something practical out of something that seems quite academic? And a lot of that time was talking through actually what is it that we're trying to achieve and what really is the purpose with the research. And before doing that sort of job, I used to do web design, and I also used to do IT support. So I've worked a lot with understanding how do people interact with computer systems, how do they interact with the internet, and then in the real world, when you're doing IT support in a hospital, how do people actually interact with IT systems on the ground, and what is the lived experience of those people? And taking into consideration all of those things means that I have a slightly different take, especially when you've done IT support in a hospital. And IT is definitely not the front and center of everybody's mind. Because in actual fact, most people have a view of security and a view of IT that isn't really something that's for them. It's something that has been done to them. That's something that has appeared in their environment and just things that they should know because it exists. But in actual fact, most people's interactions with security is quite different. So when you talk, or when I've talked to people over the last 10 or more years about what I do for a job, I have varying degrees of reaction. And a lot of it will be people glazing over because they don't want to talk to me about it at all, or they have this reaction of mild fear, because it's not for them, they think. It's for technical people, and they're not technical, so they really don't know how to approach it. And I've always felt that that's a bit disappointing, because security allows us to be free online. It allows us to have freedoms online, and it shouldn't really be seen as something to terrify people. And it should allow people to take part in it and to actually do the things that we would think would be secure behavior, for example. But one of the reasons that we struggle is because a lot of the language that we use in cybersecurity is very repetitive and actually quite negative. We use language and still use language today to determine people to be weak. And it is still used, you still hear it you still read it on Twitter, you still see it everywhere. We think that people can just be secure because we say so, because it's straightforward and easy. When in actual fact, most people's lived experiences of interacting with most computers varies. For example, if you set up two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, one thing, they have different names depending on the vendor that you're using. And then if you actually set it up, copying and pasting out of systems can be quite difficult. And I did a small research project with the UK government, and somebody who did content design actually said to me once, until you have seen a grown man cry trying to copy and paste, you have no idea how difficult most people find it. And yet we still say things, it's still just a thing in everyday language, that especially in security professional worlds, that this is just said. It's not that I think that even security professionals often mean it, that they often really put much weight behind what they're really saying. But the words mean something, and the more that it's repeated in the environment, the more then that people believe it, and it just becomes part and parcel of doing security that you start to think these things. But is that really helpful? Because in actual fact, what it does is it alienates people away from the topic that you want to discuss with them. They stop engaging, or they don't know how to start engaging even. So there's this idea of just get it over and done with, get it out of my way, I don't need to bother with this. And it stops people learning because we put barriers, because they really struggle to see themselves as part of the security conversation. And so we can do a lot to think about this. We can do a lot to change our own language. But in actual fact, We don't often have that conversation. We repeat the same things, like I say. And a lot of it comes down to just thinking that a lot of security can be bucketed into two zones. It's either good or bad. But that's not really true. If you look at security across the board in most organizations, it depends. So a security control may work in one instance here, but depending on the legacy systems, depending on the policies, depending on the process, depending on the type of work that people are doing, whether they work directly to retail, whether they're an office worker, whether they work in manufacturing, and all of these different things, this idea of good and bad doesn't quite translate. But we use language that illustrates there's a good way and a bad way. And most people get lost. We're like, actually, I don't really fit into either of those. Sometimes I will do these things. Sometimes I will do these things. And it depends. And people have created quite a lot of coping strategies around actually how they deal with security in their everyday world. But we still use language that alienates people, and it makes it out like because they're not doing perfectly good things, then they must be bad. And like I said, that builds up a language in our own mind when we're looking at it from a security professional's point of view that isn't helpful because, again, it's not that we mean it, but it's what other people perceive of it. It's what they hear, it's their perception, and then it just becomes this thing that's repeated over and over again. And we see this often as well with the use of the term easy cybersecurity. So I have a particular dislike for the word easy and a particular dislike for the word simple. And the reason for that is because I can't determine other people's ease or the simplicity to do the things that I'm asking. So a lot of my jobs have been looking in, especially at security awareness, mainly in research and then as a full-time career. And you read these things on the internet, on LinkedIn all of the time. Just do these things. These easy steps, these 10 easy steps to be cyber secure. 10 is not easy. 10 is quite a lot of things to be doing. If you break each one of those down for each vendor, then you're talking about a lot of time invested. So what does easy mean? Again, we use this word, we put this word everywhere as if it has to be there. But when I was doing a project across government, I had this speech, I gave the normal speech that I say. And so they came back to me and they were like, so what alternative word do we use? And I was just like, you don't need another word. Just say top tips, things to do, whatever illustration you want to put across. But it doesn't need the word easy. It does not need the word simple next to it to allow people to take part. Because what we're actually doing in cybersecurity and across the security profession is fitting it into people's everyday life. We want people to actually do the actions that we're suggesting, to actually take part. But if we're determining these things to be easy or simple, and then they're not doing it, we're really, really struggling to get that message across. And what it actually feels like is that we're setting them up to fail. And it feels like then that they're failing to us, and then they feel like they're failing. And so what happens is that often people feel shame, they don't talk about it, and then they will basically move away from the situation completely, where re-engaging with them becomes much harder because they don't want to feel bad, they don't want to feel shame, they don't want to be thought of as a negative. So they just think, well, it's got nothing to do with me, so I'm not going to bother. And they stop. But if somebody has stopped their interaction with you and they struggle to take part, re-engaging is a completely different problem because we're no longer treating them with openness and what have you. We have to get over the hill that we have created with that negative feeling and recreate positive pathways for them to engage differently. And that is not straightforward. So why do we really do this? Well, in security, over the years, of course, most of the language that we hear comes from the military. It's always about us versus them. We're always fighting somebody to keep somebody safe. But in actual fact, security isn't just about the adversary on the outside. Security is about the enterprise in a workplace. It's about being at home. Security is everywhere. So when we determine things to be us and them, when we talk about fighting and using military language, it doesn't quite land. So how do we break this down? Why do we still use the language that we use when we know it isn't always the most engaging? And I've worked with many a copywriter, and they say to me, it's a struggle to think of things in a positive. It's much easier to view and to frame things in a way that gives this impression. But in actual fact, we've been doing that in the security profession now for over 20 years. And if you were to read anything about, especially about awareness, about security, most people feel it's not really moving forward. And yet we still use the same language, thinking we're going to get a change. So what can we really do about it? Because in actual fact, we have created the rods for our own back. We have made this landscape really quite awkward for ourselves as security professionals, where people now have this expectation that security is just possible, because we say that we can just change people on a whim, which again is not easy or possible, but yet we use language in that way. We can just change behavior. We also tell our seniors and so forth that, and use language to them as well, that security is just this or that, which makes it seem ultimately possible. But in actual fact, security is part of a wide ecosystem in an organization where it's just one thing. There are multiple other things going on in an organization. So security often actually has to fit in. And so what happens is that we can come across as bad salespeople, because we don't get what we're expecting, because we use language that makes us think that we can just do things. We forget that then we are also influencing the seniors in our worlds and the people in our teams to make them also think that these things are possible, when in actual fact it's not. So why don't we think about changing the way that we use language, reframing the way that we see security, instead of just repeating ourselves, like I've said before? Because what we end up doing is going to this groupthink. Well, security should sound like this, because if it doesn't sound like this, then it's not security. If it doesn't have this in it, then it can't be security. And I come across this every single day. If it isn't this, for example, if you don't do phishing simulations in your organization, then you can't be doing security awareness. Why? You can do phishing in whatever way you want to do. There is no stipulation that it has to be a phishing simulation, for example. But we have, for some reason, embedded the idea phishing simulations are the only way to teach people about phishing, when in actual fact, most phishing simulations out there on the market these days just teach you about clicking on a link. But we know that that threat has moved forward, that threat has evolved. And in actual fact, most phishing these days is about building trust, is about using psychology, and about manipulating people to such a degree where it makes it actually really difficult for a lot of people. So we aren't honest. So if we look at it just as clicking on a link, which most phishing simulations do, then we are also painting a false picture of how do we know an organization is secure, because we're really not teaching people the things that they also need to know. So what people do is think, well, I didn't click on the link, so I'm secure. But it could be being manipulated through other means in their life, through trusted relationships over time, where then they just don't think about it, where we've pointed them towards different things. And we see this with business email compromise, for example, which is growing these days, where in actual fact it has nothing to do with links, has nothing to do with attachments. It's all about the manipulation of emotion. It's all about the manipulation of psychology and the recognition of people existing relationships through whether it be a third party or known business processes, because most businesses work in a very similar way. Most organizations are not particularly special. You will all have IT areas, you will all be doing accounting, finance, and so forth. So predicting what people will do in their everyday to do business email compromise is actually quite easy. But we don't teach people that. We just think, well, just don't click on the link. But it's no longer about that. But our groupthink around things like phishing simulations stops people from moving forward, because we look at one metric, click rate, or another one metric, report rate. But again, that is not the entire story. We limit our own narrative, when in actual fact, phishing simulations could be really helpful. It could tell you a narrative of actually what is the form of phishing that works better in particular areas? Is there something more that you could do to help and support those people instead of just believing it's about click rate? Is there more that is out there that could actually help and support people? Because at the end of the day, cybersecurity is about guiding people, is about supporting people, and about securing the organization and the people within it. And if we're not doing that, and if we're not telling the story in that way, it leads us often, a lot of people in the security profession, to feel burnt out because they're still thinking, why is nobody paying attention to me? Why isn't this just happening? And it feels very siloed away from actually the rest of the organization. There's a misalignment going on because, like I said, cybersecurity is complex. It has to fit in with multiple different things going on all of the time. It isn't just one person's view. It's about having conversations. It's about influencing people. And it's about basically really asking people to take part because as cybersecurity professionals, you don't own all of the infrastructure. You don't own all of the processes. You need to be able to fit in. So understanding that complexity is really, really important. Being able to talk to people is also really important because you have to be able to influence things that are going on. People have to want to come to you, but they have to want to involve you. But you can only do that if you allow them to, if you're open to them, and if you stop pointing fingers at people and thinking, well, it's your responsibility, it's your fault. I'm just telling you what to do, and I have no other part in doing it. It's not, unfortunately, it is not that straightforward. And we kind of have to move past the point where we give that impression as well, because, like I said, one of the things in security that is quite difficult is a lot of security professionals, not all by any stretch of the imagination, just repeat it at each other. It becomes part of their own narrative. I have gone to many a conference, heard many people speak, and it all seems very similar. And it's really, really difficult then to see what are they really trying to achieve and who are they really trying to achieve it for. Because security isn't for my sake as a security professional. Realistically, it's got nothing to do with me in that sense. I am here as a support function for others. So how do we make sure that we are open to others, to listen to what they're doing, to hear what they're actually saying, instead of building up these preconceived ideas of knowing, of these assumptions and this judgment that we can just do these things to people. We can just change behavior. Because you know what? You can't. In actual fact, changing behavior is, if anything, almost impossible. If you want to change behavior, you would have to set out a program for 5 to 10 years where you have the support of an entire organization, because the one thing an organization mainly does is focus on its culture. There are already programs going on. You're just one small area. So how do you get influence in those areas to make sure security is part of their conversation instead of making yourself always the center of attention? How do you use other people within your organization so you don't always need to be the storyteller of the security conversation as well? And the way you do that is by thinking about, actually, how do we use other people in the organization to support us? How do I support them? And how does that influence go on? Because if we're not doing that, what we do is we miss the diversity that actually exists in the organization. And we forget to see, is probably the easiest way to put it. We forget that, in actual fact, people aren't sheep that will just go along because you think so. They're diverse people with minds of their own, with lives every day, with things that you've never considered going on. So how do we allow people to take part? How do we see people for who they are? And to be people-centric. And to be people-centric, that is what it's about, seeing people. It's about allowing people to take part, like I said, seeing people for people, and not just thinking they're an asset in a system over here, they're an entity in a diagram over there. They're people. They're never really going to do what you expect in the way that you expect. That's okay. There is an uncertainty that comes because, like I said, an organization is complex, and so are people. But one of the massive things that I advocate for, and one of the things I think is really important that we consider in this journey, is, like I said, how we speak to each other, starting a conversation, being open to each other, and what it means to be open to each other, to actually do what is known as active listening. Instead of coming with preconceived ideas of just thinking, well, I can just tell you the answer, is to hear actually what are the things that are going on? What is it that they have to live with? So, for example, the other week we were doing a phishing simulation, and somebody got back to me in a comment, and they basically said to me, I find this deeply unfair because my job is opening emails. My job is literally opening all emails and clicking the links to make sure, because we can't miss anything. So what do you do in that instance? You're just like, actually, that's a good point. That is part of somebody's job. Now, I can take that back to my team. We can have a reasoned conversation about that, about how do we deal with these things, instead of treating everybody like it's just one homogenous group. How do we see people for who they are in an organization, trying to do their best? They do not come to work to be security experts. They do not come to work to become security experts either. They come to do their job. They come for the expertise they were hired to be, and they often are interrupted with security. But if we start to have a different sort of conversation, it breaks down those barriers and it allows people to come forward, and it builds the need for collaboration, because people will want to speak to you because they want to learn. Most people are really, really open to learning. So what do we do with all of these pieces? There are lots of things that I've said. There's lots of things to think about. But what do we really do about that? Well, like I said, to be people-centric, you have to think about, actually, your everyday interaction, because I get told about the language that I use and the thought that I put into stuff, but it's taken time. This is not straightforward to do. To consider people, to see people, you need to stand back a little bit and reflect on yourself, because it can seem that, and I get told this quite regularly in actual fact, well, I'm good at communicating. I communicate with people every single day. It's common sense. So I know what I'm doing. When in actual fact, most people don't talk to each other to have dialogue. They may communicate, but communication often is just one way, and you're just pushing information at people. To create dialogue, to create connection, to create collaboration is about bringing people with you, about involving them, about hearing them, and that continuous loop. Because it is always ongoing. And the reason I say that is because we have to realize in cybersecurity, the language that we use and the way that we say it often treats people as if they don't know, as if they're unknowing, as if they've not really heard of security before, and we just need to tell them these, like I said, these 10 things, and the world is perfectly secure. But it doesn't work like that. So this was a piece of research done by the National Cybersecurity Center a number of years ago. And the question asks, basically, how much do you know? How do you feel about it? And the majority of people feel they know a great deal or fair amount about cybersecurity. That's interesting. 68% of people feel they understand cybersecurity enough in their everyday. But yet we give messaging as if they don't know, as if they just need to do something else. And there's obviously a misalignment here going on. Our communications, the way that we speak, gives the impression as if people don't know. Now, I don't know what people know, but they feel they know. They have their own perception that they know. And we have to pay attention to the fact. So we have to think about the way that we use language. Instead of treating them as not knowing, actually admit you have come across security all of the time. Every single day, every action you take will have some form of security at some point, whether it's putting in a password, resetting a password, doing some sort of two-factor checking, MIT ID type stuff when you're in Denmark and so forth. All of that is a form of security. Because if we don't change the way that we think, and we don't alter the way we give our messaging, the way we do our cyber awareness, for example, what we miss is that our words have power. And it just becomes very, not boring, I don't want to use the word boring to be that negative, it just becomes very repetitive. And what people actually feel is that they already know. They already know this, so why should they pay attention? They already know, so they stop thinking that they need to pay attention. When in actual fact, the threats in cybersecurity are evolving, they are growing, maybe in small areas, in small parts, but it does mean that the messaging does change, and there are new things that we have to say to people. So how do we get people to actually pay attention and want to pay attention? Well, part of the message in doing that is to be positive. Instead of looking at things from the negative, framing things from the positive is really important, because it's about the opportunity to do something. It allows you to. It's not about fear from. And changing that mindset opens the world to the type of words that can be chosen, the type of language that is used, because it's actually really difficult for a lot of people to see what that really means. And I'm going to give one very quick example. So when we talk about passwords, a lot of the time, especially in training and especially in everyday life, we hear the term weak passwords. So there's a really, really good blog that was written many, many years ago, The Secret Life of Passwords, in the New York Times. And this is a blog that talks through some the ways that they had to basically hack their own systems to get into the stock market after 9/11, because the passwords were unique, and obviously after that tragedy, they couldn't get into them, and that was one of their issues. But the blog goes on to talk about actually how did they do that, and then the life of a password beyond that. And what it shows you, if you think about your own passwords a lot of the time, if you're not using the technology that's out there to advance your passwords, if you're creating your own passwords, what you do is you think of the words yourself, you create them yourself, and you feel ownership, because passwords aren't benign pieces of information often. They're often things to do with your personal life. I know that we say, don't pick a dog's name, don't do this, but a lot of people still do those things. So then when we determine them to be weak, we say to them, actually, that password isn't very good. What we're saying is that piece of information about you, your dog's name, is rubbish. They feel something when you say that. That doesn't go without any sort of impact on them, because they're like, oh, okay, well, what am I meant to do about that? You don't put them in a state of then thinking how to help them. You put them in a state of thinking, well, I don't have better words. These are things that mean something to me. If they mean something to me, I'm more likely to remember them. And I have so many passwords. How on earth will I remember them all if I'm not using things that I recognize and things that I create? So we create this really awkward space for people where in actual fact it's not that straightforward. It's not as easy as it seems just to say these words. The words we use have impact, and over time we've used these words constantly, and it has more and more impact. They are not benign things to say. And everything we do is about sharing our experiences. So we will tell people they have weak passwords, but if we don't then tell them what to do, they won't share, they won't talk about it, they keep it to themselves, they silo themselves away from each other, and they don't learn from each other. When in actual fact, what we're looking for in security is collaboration. We want people to not feel shame, we want people to share, and we want people to feel that they can. And this is really, really important, because security is in our everyday. Everything we see, there's loads of media about it. There is actually an entire film about passwords. Now, I don't know if you've seen this film. So this is a film called Home. It's a children's animation. And the basis for this entire film is passwords. So there's an alien race that drops to the Earth, takes over the Earth, takes all the people up to wherever, and the characters, I can't remember their names, sorry, I've forgotten, want to have a party because they've taken over the Earth. And now they have all of the same passwords, and basically the email goes to the wrong person. They want to stop the email before the people come. So they're like, well, I'll just use the same password, because everybody uses the same password to make it easier. But no, this alien has used a unique password, and then the entire film is about trying to find him to get his password so they can stop the message before their enemies come to the party that they've just sent an email about. I mean, so when we think about security, we often give the idea that it's special, that it's different, that it's all of these things, that it's too much for a lot of people, that it's not part of their everyday, like I said, that we use language that can distance itself. But in actual fact, it's in our media all of the time. You see it in films everywhere, the use of passwords and so forth, and other things, not just passwords. It's just the easiest example. So what are we really trying to get across to people? Because there is something else going on. We ourselves, as security professionals, need to consider, actually, how do we help people? How do we reflect? We don't need other people to think that they need to change, to appreciate things.
Men også man tog Fagno. Din storebror står hernede ved informationen. Og det er også man tog Fagno. Du skal komme ned til informationen, hvor din storebror venter.
So, we need to think of security instead as an experience. It's something, like I said, that has many interaction points. We, as security professionals, ourselves, need to reflect on, actually, this is an experience that we want people to come along with. We want people to take part. We want to allow people to take part, and they have to feel they can take part. And that is a perception that they have to hold. And our language is deeply important to that, because we have built up a preconceived idea. And it's not to say that we need to be perfect first time. This is about practice. We're not looking for 5 stars, we're not looking for perfection, because like I said, security evolves. So we have to be really realistic to ourselves as well, and be really honest that it isn't straightforward. You may need help from other people. But it's about starting that conversation. And like I said, I know I've said it a few times, but this is where I think it says it best. This is a quote from a guy called Paul Martin in a book, The Rules of Security, Staying Safe in a Risky World, which I highly recommend reading. And realistically, security frees us to concentrate on doing what we really want to do, both now and in the future. And like I said, we're not teaching people to be security experts. They shouldn't need to be security experts to take part in security. For example, I don't really care if you want to call multi-factor authentication JIM in your workplace. Call it JIM. If people understand what JIM is and are performing the action, does it really matter the name that we're calling it? Often security professionals get very stuck on the ideology that it has to be perfect to be good. And that's not true. It just needs to be useful, to be usable, to be actionable. And that's what's really, really important, because in actual fact, what we're trying to achieve is to allow people to fit it in, to do their hobbies, to do their everyday action, to do things as they want, and to just be able to also do security as an aside. It shouldn't take all of this amount of time. It shouldn't take an hour to do those 10 steps, or 4 hours to do those 10 steps, or however long it can take some people to do. It should just be possible. Because if we're not thinking of that, who is the cybersecurity really for? What are we really trying to achieve? Because often it can look like it's just for the cybersecurity professional trying to achieve a tick on a list, trying to achieve their own objective. But in actual fact, it is about supporting and guiding people in an organization. It is about supporting the organization, the enterprise, the people within the organization to be secure. So I've tried to put together the way that I think about being people-centric, or starting to think people-centric. This is by no means all of it. This is just a start of that journey. So lots of people think, well, how do you do that? Well, like I said, it's not to think there's anything massive. It's just to stop every now and again and check yourself and think, who is this for? What is the purpose? Does this really get across what I mean it to get across? And does this translate in the way that I expect? Because if you can't answer all of those questions, or you're not confident in those, then just ask someone else. Ask someone else to double check. Ask someone else to read it, just to think, actually, that's something I say all the time, and I've got used to saying it, but does it work for somebody else? And be really, really open to feedback. So when I give things out to people, my main thought is, if I give like a piece of comms out to somebody or I've written something and there's no feedback, I am often concerned because I think, I am not the knowledge in this. These people are, they must have something to say. So be very, very open and just change things. If people don't agree, have a conversation. Create that dialogue to have really honest conversations about what security you're trying to achieve, what are the real risks, who is it really for, and what are we really trying to achieve. And like I said, consider the language in your everyday, just for the moment. Reflect on the words and think, is that really the best way of putting it across? And practice. This is not easy. It's actually quite difficult for people to stick to that way of thinking. And then to be a champion, not to give in to the negativity that often exists. Because if we're not doing that, then what happens is that people turn off. Not only the people that we're trying to give security to or help security with, it's also to the profession. And you find that a lot where people, like I said in the earlier slide, get very burnt out with regards to the things that are said in security. Because security is creative. It's really positive. It is a lot of opportunity and chance to change things and to really help and support people. And the impact that you can have and the realization you can give to people when they know that A, security isn't all and everything that they need to be responsible for. In actual fact, they just have a role and it may be this one item and they can achieve that. The self-worth that they feel in being able to see that they can take part is immense and great. So don't underestimate the impact you can have by thinking about your own language, because people aren't going to climb the hill to you. You need to bring your knowledge to them. And if we can't achieve that, then it's going to be really, really difficult. Because what we really want to achieve is that we feel that it is something we can do together. Without everybody playing a role, then we are always going to be thinking there's something wrong, something missing. But in actual fact, if people can just collaborate, tell us things, feel able, not going to be judged, and they don't feel any shame, the more likely we can have a healthy, more productive conversation about the real security in an organization and how to improve it, whether that be a policy, whether that be a process, whether that be technology that just has never worked. It allows us to have those conversations and it allows us to break down those barriers and to then better shape and form the organization and the security within it to fit the needs of both the security and the people. Thank you. That's all of my talk today.